All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I was giving people a couple more minutes to join, but it looks like we've got a good amount of folks, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I also have quite a bit of content to get through today. For those who aren't familiar, my name is Isabel McLain, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Virginia Housing Alliance. We are a statewide nonprofit working to increase access to affordable housing and end and prevent homelessness across the Commonwealth. Today, I am going to present our Federal Advocacy 101 training, which we created to support housing advocates across Virginia, specifically with greater knowledge of how our federal government works and guidance on how to strategically engage in those processes. This is especially important now as we face significant changes and growing uncertainty at the federal level regarding housing policy and beyond. So I want to thank each of you for joining today, each of you who took time out of your day to hopefully get what is helpful information to you to help equip you for further advocacy. And I look forward to advocating with you in the future. So a few housekeeping items before I begin. The webinar is recorded, and the recording as well as the slides will be sent out to all who registered, probably by the end of this week. There are several resources and links on the slides that I will refer to, so we'll definitely share the actual slides with you so you can have access to those links. I'm not going to paste each one of those in the chat now, but you will get those by the end of this week. I do have quite a bit of content to get through, but I will try to take some time at the end for questions. If you want to go ahead, if you do have a question that comes up and you're afraid you might not remember it, you could go ahead and put it in the chat throughout my presentation, but I might not get to it until the end as I'm focused on continuing through the content itself. So here is a general overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to first go into an introduction of our federal government, then dive a little bit deeper into the legislative, budgetary, and regulatory processes, so how exactly our government gets work done. Then I'm going to take a little bit of a break to share resources and tips for how to apply this knowledge to our current situation, how to stay updated as decisions and actions are taken at the federal level through these processes, and how you can stay up to date and engage in those processes. And then we will transition to a discussion about tips for advocacy, what it means to engage in advocacy, what's that is like versus lobbying, what are kind of the rules and best practices around there, as well as guidance for meeting with legislators and how to talk with them. Specifically, this is geared towards our federal legislators, but a lot of these tips can be applied to any sort of advocacy you do, whether it's at the state or local level as well. Alrighty, so hold on one second. I need to see my notes real quick. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my overview of the federal government. So specifically, I'm not going to do a deep dive into everything. This isn't going to be like a government 101 class entirely, but I will be focusing just briefly on the legislative branch and the executive branch, specifically how the work that they do relates to housing and what specific pieces to look for. So let's move on here. So specifically, our legislative branch is made up of Congress. This is our elected officials, our specifically two different chambers, our Senate and our House of Representatives. There are 100 senators, 2 per state, and 435 representatives, which that number is determined based on population in each state. Our Congress is our legislative body. It's up to them to pass laws regarding various programs, how they work, across the board here. And they also make decisions about how our programs are funded. So as that relates to housing, they make decisions about how these programs work and how they are funded. The executive branch, which I'll get to in a minute, is tasked primarily with implementing those laws and running and administering the programs that are set up by Congress. So it's up to Congress to first set everything up. And as I said, it's made up of two of these chambers. We determine as US citizens who is in our Congress. We elect representatives every 2 years, and senators serve a 6-year term, but it's on a staggered election cycle, so not all senators are up for election at the same time. And then once we've elected our Congress, among those legislators, they determine specific leadership positions that have more very varied levels of power within Congress and help determine how it functions and gets things done. So there's leadership positions in each chamber and also political party. Those in these leadership positions then go on to make decisions about other key leadership positions, and they appoint people to different committees, which these are the groups of legislators that dive deeper into certain topics as a way to ensure that all of this work gets done in an organized manner. And so they determine who's a member of each of those committees and who is also a chair of that committee. I say this because it's really important to know who is in leadership in these leadership positions, who is on various committees, who's a member of those committees, who's potentially the chair of those committees, because that really impacts who you're supposed to be talking to when you're engaging in advocacy, where are the pressure points that you need to be focused on, and who could potentially have more power than others on a specific topic that you're advocating for. I list here a couple of the main leadership positions, names that you've probably heard in the news or know of yourself already. The President of the Senate, the President pro tempore of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House, which right now Republicans have the majority in both the House and the Senate. And so these leadership positions, usually they follow the political party that is in the majority. So all three of these positions are Republicans. Now, as I just mentioned, you want to know who legislators are so that you know where, certain power, decisions lie and who to target. But you always want to also know just who is your representative, who is your actual legislator, because that's where actually you carry the most power. So even though Congress is serving, the entire country, each person that we elect is accountable to the folks who elect them. And so they are going to give preference and priority to the opinions of their constituents. So those who live in their actual district or state who helped elect them. And so you always want to know who is actually representing you. You can do this fairly easily on many different websites. The easiest is congress.gov. There's a very simple place where you can put in your address and determine who your representative and who your senators are. Now, beyond just knowing their names and what committee they're a part of, it's also helpful to get even more background information on, who they are, what are their, topics that they're passionate about, what sort of information and skills and experience do they bring to this, etc. And there's a resource that we at VHA created last year in preparation for the 119th Congress, starting this January, that has more background information on all members of our Virginia delegation to Congress. It's just a handy dandy who is your legislator guide. Again, the link to this will be included in the site, so you'll be able to access it when we send that out. But I recommend taking a look at it because it's very helpful to really know more about your legislator beyond just their name. All right, so when does Congress in session? When do they actually do their work? So as I said, this is the 119th Congress. Technically, that's based on the number of the session, the legislative session, which usually runs from January of 1 year to a January in 2 years. So January 2025 to January 2027 is the one we're currently in. They meet year round. So they're supposed to always be doing this work, but they do have several planned recesses or breaks throughout. the longest of which occurs in August. So we are actually right now at the very beginning of the August recess, where they are out the entire month, which basically means they're back in their districts. They're not necessarily in DC. These committees aren't meeting, they aren't having hearings or voting on bills at the moment. And that's supposed to be a time where they're really supposed to be engaging with the folks in their district. It makes them a little bit more accessible, so folks don't have to necessarily travel to DC to talk to their legislators, but they're now in their home districts. Here I put a picture of a what is my favorite source for a Congress calendar. It's actually put together by, I think, the National Association of Broadcasters randomly, but I just really like the way they have it color coordinated. But they have a great calendar that just shows when the House is in session, when the Senate is in session, because they don't always follow the same breaks. They both follow the August recess. They're both out, but to know kind of where they are throughout, there are some great resources like this one, again linked to in the slides, so you can see that. Now, as far as who or what makes up the executive branch, this is specifically the president, the vice president, the president's cabinet or administration, and the federal departments or agencies that, as I said earlier, administer the programs that Congress has, passed and set up. I've listed here the specific agencies that most relate to our work in housing that are important to keep track of. Many of you may already totally be familiar with them, but if not, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, is probably what is the most important one to follow. There is also the Interagency Council on Homelessness, although I'll say right now it is effectively shuttered with all staff on administrative leave, so that agency is not quite up and running. There's also the Agriculture Rural Housing Service, so under the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the Treasury, and the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA. Those are the agencies that I follow most when I'm keeping track of different federal programs that relate to housing. All right, so now that we've know who's kind of who, what the legislative branch and executive branch looks like, I'm going to dive deeper into the actual work that they do. So first, I'm going to talk through the legislative process and how bills become law at the federal level. This will probably not be as fun as Schoolhouse Rock's songs about, a bill sitting on Capitol Hill. I'm not going to be singing for you, but I hope it'll be just as informative. I'm just going to do kind of a brief overview here, but if you all have more questions, we can dive deeper in at the end. So initially, a bill starts its life when it's introduced, when it's drafted by a senator or representative. It gets like titled, or it gives it a number that's assigned to it. So you may see like H.R. Some number 58 or something, and that's referring to a bill, or S. if it's a bill that was introduced in the Senate. Once it's introduced and drafted, it's referred to a relevant committee, usually based on kind of what topic, what issue it deals with. It goes to the relevant committee or even subcommittee if that committee is divided up further for more specific issues. This is where most of the actual work on, debating the bill, potentially making changes to it, talking about it, where the real meat of that sort of process occurs is at the committee level. So they'll discuss it, potentially amend it, and vote on it. If it makes it out of the committee, it's then discussed, potentially amended, and voted on by the full chamber, what's called kind of like a floor vote. So when it's on the floor, they have the same chance again to make changes to it, and then we'll vote if they want it to proceed. A bill usually requires a simple majority to pass, so just more folks voted yes for it than not. However, the Senate is a bit unique. You would need 60 votes in the Senate to pass if you want to avoid what's called a filibuster. Now, this is a tool that exists because the Senate has a tradition of unlimited debate. The House does not have unlimited debate, but the Senate does allow this. And so like a filibuster specifically is an action that is taken where you're engaging in a ton of debate. You're basically trying to delay a vote on a bill. You're trying to do prolonged debate, potentially prevent a change or a vote on a bill, an amendment to it, or et cetera. But you can technically debate it unlimited, forever. And this can potentially prevent that bill from moving forward if there's some sort of time crunch, et cetera. And so if you want to avoid all of that and just have a clean cut, this bill passes without unlimited debate, you need to have 60 votes. So that's important to keep in mind because, as I said earlier, right now, Republicans have the majority in the House and the Senate, but they do not have more than 60 in the Senate. So while they do have a minor majority, they cannot necessarily all pass a bill as all Republicans and avoid a filibuster, unless there are certain rules, which I'll get into later. Okay, so once a bill passes out of one chamber, whichever the Senate or House that it was introduced in, it passes to the other, and it goes through the same process, gets referred to a committee, potentially amended and voted on, and then gets sent to the floor where the whole chamber votes on it. If it is changed, if the version of it that passes out of the second chamber is different than the first chamber, they create what's called a committee of conference, where they appoint certain legislators in the House and the Senate to come together to work through those different versions and come up with a bill that can then repass through both chambers that they both can agree upon. And then that's the version that ultimately gets signed by the Speaker of the House, then the Vice President, and then on to the President. The President has 10 days to either sign or veto a bill. If a bill is vetoed, it can still become law if both chambers vote to override that veto with a 2/3 majority. All right, so now moving on to how is the budget decided? So it technically still is decided through legislation, so through that process I just mentioned, but it's not determined by any one piece of legislation, and it can get a little bit complicated for what types, what they each do, and how that works. There's legislation related to tax, so what we get as revenue, what money we have to actually spend, and then what our budget, what our spending is. Some of our tax and spending legislation is permanent until it's changed, until a law is passed that changes it. Some covers many years, and it only requires like periodic renewal. So it could be something that this is the funding for the next 5 years, et cetera. And in 5 years, they would take up legislation again to change it. And I will say most of it is decided each year and passed through annual appropriation bills. So there's different types based on how often they're passed. And then it's helpful to look at spending by two different types of spending. So there, in our government, it's divided into what's called mandatory or discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is almost entirely made up of funding for entitlements. And the amount of that is funding that is budgeted for that is based on a formula that is applied to the entire number of households that are eligible for that benefit. So that includes Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, SNAP or food stamps, TANF, etc., other programs. For mandatory spending, it's not necessary to pass legislation each year to determine the funding because the legislation itself includes that formula that determines it. But you can pass legislation, Congress can propose legislation and pass it to change that formula, change the eligibility and update that, whenever there is the will to do that. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, is set annually. So that is done through what's called the appropriations process. For this spending, there's a law that's set up that that's kind of separate from this spending bill that has created this program, etc., maybe created eligibility for it, but it doesn't include a funding formula because essentially a lot of these programs are not necessarily set up to serve every single person who would be eligible. but there is then a set budget that goes towards these programs that is determined in the annual bills. This includes most of the housing related funding that we utilized, as well as, funding for federal departments, how they like operational budgets, and almost all of our defense spending is also discretionary. So it is this piece, the annual appropriations bills, that I spend most of my time paying attention to because that is what most closely relates to housing. But, everything is ultimately related to housing, so you can't totally close off the rest of it. But it's important to understand these two differences because it does help then understand what certain bills have passed and how these decisions are made. So at a minimum, Congress must pass the annual appropriations bills. Every year they have to cover their discretionary programs. That's the federal budget that is passed, where if they don't pass it, potentially we could face a government shutdown because all of the operational spending, et cetera, to run these government programs and agencies hasn't been renewed, et cetera. So it's all of the regular upkeep and operations. And then, as I said before, for the mandatory spending, it's not required every year, but they can pass legislation to change that. They will periodically have to pass legislation to renew certain programs that maybe have periodic expiration dates, et cetera. And then, of course, they can always pass legislation that changes how much revenue and sort of like tax bills there. So outside of the annual appropriations process, there's what's called to kind of start off your whole budget plan for the year, there's what's called a budget resolution. So Congress has to, if they pass this is basically setting up a big plan. It's more of like a big picture type of bill that sets targets for each of the congressional committees to propose legislation that will appropriate funds or change, a spending or a tax law. So this covers all of the type of spending I said. It's a general plan. Like if they want to pass a bill that changes mandatory spending, they would include that as part of this resolution that gives their kind of goals for what they want to do. It doesn't require a president's signature. It's more for the sake of getting Congress on board with their general plan for all the rest of the pieces of legislation that they have to pass. The resolution then can trigger what's called a budget reconciliation process. And this is an optional special procedure to enact major spending and tax changes that allows for relatively quick consideration of bills. So it limits debate. So in the Senate, they no longer have the ability to filibuster to do that unlimited debate. So instead, just a simple majority is required in the Senate. But I will say that this tool is supposed to be very limited and that it's shouldn't include other types of topics or things. That really has to be very limited to topics of spending and tax changes. I bring this up because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that you all may have heard that passed at the beginning of July, that is a budget reconciliation bill. And that specifically is dealing with the mandatory spending that I mentioned. It is related to spending and tax changes. Not necessarily, it doesn't relate to the discretionary types of spending that would be through annual appropriation bills, but it's dealing with the mandatory spending and different revenue changes. And because they did it through the budget reconciliation process, they did not need to have 60 votes in the Senate necessarily. They were able to forego that filibuster rule to get that passed. So that's kind of shows you the power of this process and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, if you want to call it that, it is an example of that. Now, to put this into a general timeline, the fiscal year for the federal government starts in October 1st. And so if, the actual annual appropriations bills have to be passed by October 1st to avoid what I mentioned earlier, to avoid a government shutdown, to ensure that the funding for all the operations continues. So the process starts generally with the president announcing a budget request, kind of the administration's goals and plans for the budget. It's developed in collaboration with federal agencies. Federal agencies kind of report to the president what they would request to be funded at. It's all kind of put together. However, the president is not the one that ultimately passes and has control over the budget. That does lie in Congress. So this is just a budget request. It starts the process, but Congress is not necessarily held to it. They do not have to include everything that was, in the president's budget request, but it does set the stage and start that process. Then Congress passes their resolution, as I said earlier, their plan, and they kind of take into consideration the president's budget request. And then if they want to pass a reconciliation bill or other mandatory spending bills, that can happen after that point. But as far as the actual annual appropriations process, then it goes to the appropriations committees themselves. And they choose top line numbers for each of their 12 subcommittees, which these 12 subcommittees are divided by different subjects. The one that I pay attention most to is the THUD subcommittee, which is Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. So that's the issue topics that they deal with, and that's what determines funding for most of our housing programs. Once the committees pass their bills, and then their bills are passed on the floor, each chamber has to vote and pass it as well. If at that point, a lot of debate occurs because the House bill and the Senate bill may be different, so they need to figure out how to resolve those differences, etc. And then eventually the president must sign the budget bills as well. So I say that this kind of starts some debate because as we've seen in the recent few years, we get to this stage and then there's quite a lot of prolonged debate. If they feel like they have not reached an agreement by the start of the fiscal year, October 1st, they can pass what's called a continuing resolution, which is set for a certain date, and basically it just continues to fund the government at level funding from the budget in the previous fiscal year until they're able to come up with an agreement. So this is actually what we experienced last year. They were not able to pass a new budget, and so they ended up passing a continuing resolution for the entirety of fiscal year 25. There were some changes to it. There are like some tweaks here and there, but it was largely level funding from fiscal year 24. If you want to keep track of the budget process, the National Low Income Housing Coalition does a lot of analysis and tracks this process really well. They update a budget chart with each of the changes that occur. And I recommend, using this resource to stay abreast of this process. This is what they have right now that was just updated at the end of July because the House and the Senate have just released and passed their versions of these appropriation bills. So we've reached that stage now. And if you want more information, the link to this will be in the slides. Now moving on to the actions that the executive branch takes, so more of the regulatory side of things. I want to mention executive orders because there have been several of these this year, and some people are confused about what these actually do and what sort of power they have. So just as a reminder, again, Congress is the one that actually passes laws and makes a lot of those decisions. The executive branch is just tasked with implementing those. So executive orders are a tool that that the president administration can take to direct the departments that it oversees to kind of put specific priorities, etc., basically directing on how these programs and these laws are implemented. And there is some room to change different things, to change, priorities. So, for example, I think this is a maybe helpful example here. Like, Congress, they technically make a law and declare, what drugs, for example, are illegal or legal. But with an executive order, a president can tell the Department of Justice, if prioritizing or if prosecuting certain drug cases is a priority or not. You can say that's technically illegal, but with our energy, we're going to prioritize instead going after these different cases. So it's not necessarily changing the law, but changing maybe the ways in which it's administered with limited capacity, the ways in which funding is given out, what's the priority for funding. Can't necessarily say what's not eligible for funding, but what gets that priority. And of course, there is influence in here too on how quickly that funding gets out, etc. So that's important to know because I know that there have been a lot of executive orders that, may seem pretty large in scope, but these are technically the guardrails for executive orders. And of course, there's a lot of question on how some of these will be executed or enforced. Another piece of the regulatory process that, is sometimes influenced by executive orders if they direct and want to start some of these changes is what is done through rulemaking. So each of the departments have certain rules that they take. Basically, when Congress passes a new law, they review that law, etc., and then they have what's called, basically they have time to then propose a new rule or a new regulation to basically implement that law. I don't have as much time as I was hoping to go through all of the details of this, but essentially anytime a department wants to change a regulation or kind of start what's called this rulemaking process, there are rules for how they could do this and how quickly they can do it. Any sort of proposed rulemaking does have to allow for public comment and give the public opportunity to weigh in. Usually it's a 60-day period. Sometimes, they can do a public comment first if they know they want to do a rule change but don't know quite yet and would like to get that feedback earlier on. But public comment is a required piece of this. So I say this because it's important to keep track of this and to know when there are opportunities to weigh in on this rulemaking process. This is still where a lot of change and influence can be had, even if it may not necessarily be our typical, advocating for a bill process that we think of. It's really important that we're also engaged through its implementation too, and can weigh in when certain decisions about that are being made. There's a website called regulations.gov where you can see different rules in the process here. This is also where notices of public comment are posted too. This is where you can keep track of that and see when those opportunities arise. Alrighty, so now that I've just given you a ton of information, and I hope I didn't fully overwhelm you yet, I do want to give you a couple resources to apply what I've just shared to our current environment, kind of where we are now. I just told you a lot about how bills are passed, how regulations are made, etc., and how can you keep track of when those decisions are being made. The Virginia Housing Alliance and our partners at Housing Forward Virginia put together and are maintaining and managing a federal housing action tracker that we started earlier this year that posts any sort of federal actions that are taken that relate to housing. There has been, as I mentioned earlier, just so many changes and a lot to keep track of. And so we created this, seeing a real need for it. It should have really anything related to housing that is being done at the under kind of the executive branch, through the budgetary process, etc. It does not. We don't have the capacity to follow every single bill that's related to housing that is proposed and updated, especially because Congress proposes a lot of bills and sometimes not a lot of action always gets taken on those. So there's a lot out there. So I say that to say don't look to this as a full comprehensive legislative tracker necessarily, but this is where you can go to see updates change from the different executive orders, updates to the budget, different department directives, announcements about different funding priorities, etc. So I encourage you to follow that as a way to stay in the know. We also are hosting monthly federal impact meetings for Virginia's housing community. We started these up in March, I think. Yeah, I think it was March or maybe April. March. We started in March. But this is for basically anyone in the housing community, anyone working in housing or an advocate for housing interested that wants to come together monthly, where we share a deeper dive into all these updates. We work with some of our federal partners at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and Enterprise Community Solutions to share what they're seeing on the ground. and just give an opportunity for folks to kind of discuss what they're seeing, share opportunities for advocacy, ask questions, and support each other. So if you are not already a part of this and are interested, you can definitely reach out to us at our VHA, VirginiaHousingAlliance.org email to get added to that list, to start coming to those meetings. We kind of schedule those a couple weeks in advance based on when our federal partners are available. So we don't quite have a date yet for August, but we'll be hopefully deciding that fairly soon. I also encourage you to sign up for our action alerts. So we send out kind of calls to actions or alerts when it's really strategic. There's an opportunity where it's really important for you all to reach out to your legislators to weigh in on a certain issue or certain kind of legislation. We're actually working on one right now. It's just not quite finished yet, but it will be very soon. So if you're not already signed up for our action alerts, please do, because we'll be sending out a call to action about the budget. As I mentioned a little bit earlier when I referred to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's budget chart, we're at this place now where both the House and the Senate have released their annual appropriation bills. We know what they've proposed for funding for HUD, and it's a really important time to try to contact them, especially while they're in district in August. You know, if you're able to reach out to them and have any sort of engagement with them, and tell them the importance of funding affordable housing and homelessness programs, how we need to expand those, you know, at the very least protect, but also expand them, and really connect those programs to the stories and to real tangible examples of why those programs are important. I'll also highlight that on our website, we have created congressional district housing profiles. So these are resources that go into depth about housing facts, needs, kind of data about each congressional district. This we created as a resource for some of our engagement with members of Congress, but also you all can use this too to bring with you to meetings with members of Congress to help educate them on what's going on in their district and really provide them with that data. You know, numbers and data are important and interesting. I will say it's always helpful to also pair that with stories too, to really bring it home. But we hope that this is a helpful resource for you all, and I encourage you to use these if you need them for any meetings that you might have. And then I'll briefly touch on this. Again, you'll get these links in the slides, but there are several resources that the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition have that can be very, very helpful, that I definitely use a lot in my federal advocacy as well. I've listed several of them here. Both of them have resources about the fiscal year 26 budget process, which we're in the middle of right now, and different advocacy toolkits with other information, as well as they regularly have their own calls to action and policy alerts as well. Alrighty, whoa, sorry. Okay, now we're moving on to the last section of this, and hopefully I can wrap up in time to get some questions. But taking a step back, less on the actual nitty-gritty details, but more on kind of what it means to engage in advocacy, and how to actually engage in all of these processes that I have rattled on about today. So it's really important that we ground this in an understanding of the difference between advocacy and lobbying. Because I think a lot of folks that I've seen in my experience, and also before I got more into this work, I also misunderstood this difference. But a lot of folks sometimes are nervous about engaging in advocacy because there are certain restrictions and rules about lobbying. But those rules really only apply to lobbying and not to advocacy in general. So let me go into a little bit more depth by what I mean by each of these. So lobbying is specifically defined by the IRS as an attempt to influence specific legislation at either the local, state, or federal level. They do further define this to include grassroots lobbying, which is involving direct asks, again, trying to get direct acts related to specific legislation, but trying to get other members of the public to take action for that same purpose, to influence specific legislation. Advocacy itself, the primary focus is more on education about a specific issue. And it doesn't relate to a very specific piece of legislation, but it can relate to an issue topic, the importance of affordable housing, um, how homeless services programs are functioning, et cetera, the need for greater support for people experiencing homelessness, et cetera. There are absolutely no limits to advocacy. The easy way to kind of think about the difference here is that lobbying asks for legislative action, whereas advocacy asks for a legislator's attention. So that's kind of a helpful way to think about this and frame this. If you only feel comfortable engaging more in advocacy, but not lobbying, then you'd want to gear your approach towards more education, focus more on getting their attention on broader topics, and less so focused on specific legislative acts, or you're not trying to get them to necessarily take a specific action. You may be saying you need to support housing more. There are things that we need to do to meet these needs, but not necessarily referring to a specific bill or specific kind of action there. So some examples. Meeting or writing to legislators asking them to support a specific increase in funding or support a piece of legislation, a specific bill. Calling that congressperson or just even talking to their staff still counts as lobbying by asking them to write a letter to a chair of a committee in support of a specific piece of legislation. It is also considered lobbying when you send a call to action to members of the public, asking them to, write to their legislator about a specific funding increase or specific program or policy. However, for advocacy, all of these things don't count as lobbying and can be done unrestricted. So distributing fact sheets to legislators about the success of a government-funded program, or the way that these programs are limited due to inadequate funding. Disseminating an analysis of a specific piece of legislation over, social media or to the public. Inviting legislators to site visits, or, just having kind of educational meetings with them. Meeting with legislators in response to requests for information. So if they initiate it, if they say, I'm working on this specific bill and I'd like your input, that still just counts as advocacy. Even if they're asking for your position, even if it is a specific piece of legislation. Providing commentary or responding to requests for information during the regulatory process. So giving that public comment that I mentioned earlier, engaging in any sort of administrative advocacy for or against an executive order. Again, that is not considered lobbying. That is considered advocacy. Now, what I think is the biggest rub here on determining if you're able to engage in advocacy or lobbying are rules that are set up for nonprofits or for recipients of federal funding. But it's important to know that nonprofit 501c3 organizations can do both. You can advocate and you can lobby. However, there are certain limitations for lobbying for nonprofits. So I do want to go through those just so you understand. But the important piece here is that you can, granted, each of your organizations might have certain policies yourselves for how you would determine this. But according to the IRS, there is, nonprofits are able to do this. However, there are limitations based on how much time and money is spent on lobbying. So as long as lobbying is not a substantial part of your organization's activities or time, substantial is not explicitly defined by the IRS, but general recommendations are, about 5% of your activities. You can also elect to use a separate process to have your lobbying limits determined by expenditures, so how much of your budget you spend on lobbying. In general, nonprofits are not allowed to campaign for electoral candidates, but that is different from lobbying. But I still do put that in here because that's an important distinction to make. And then in general, it is recommended not to use, if you're a recipient of federal funding, not to use those funds to cover the expenses of lobbying, even though you still can lobby, but it's just general practices not to use those funds to do that. Granted, again, I'm not a qualified attorney or legal expert. This is not legal advice. This is just a general interpretation of what those limits are. I encourage you all to consult with an actual attorney or legal expert for determining your policies and determining exactly if you're a 501c3, how you want to engage in this. But it's important to know that there are pathways forward where a representative of a nonprofit can engage in lobbying. But again, advocacy, free reign. So again, yeah, right here. As always, there's no limits on advocacy, or if you are lobbying as an individual, not on behalf of your organization. So I always say this too, because some folks who I work with, that are nonprofits say, oh, well, we can't necessarily fill out this call to action, as representatives of our organization. But they can say, I'm an individual, this is my name. You could say you work in homeless services, more broadly, and that's kind of your position on this. You don't have to necessarily name and be speaking on behalf of your organization, but you can still speak on a specific piece of legislation and do that sort of lobbying as an individual. So always keep that in mind as well. Okay, cool. Now I'm just going to wrap up with some tips about how to meet with legislators, what that really looks like, what to expect, and some general guidance here. So I mentioned this earlier when I referred to kind of who makes up Congress and how that works, but I'll say it again. It's important to know who you're going to meet with, who your legislators are, and some information about their background, and what sort of committees they're a part of. And again, if you or someone in your team or group that's meeting with a legislator is a constituent, it's really important to mention that. Again, you have more power over a legislator who represents you in your district. Of course, always prepare in advance. You want to be mindful. Legislators are very, very, very busy. And so what time you get with them or their staff can be limited. So you want to make sure that you're using their time and attention that you are able to get well. So these are just some general tips. I always encourage folks to even with all of this, this is all how the federal government works and all these processes and information and traditions, etc., that these are people. These are just people. And they're not an expert in everything. In fact, you are an expert yourself and your experience and your work in the housing world. And so try to approach these meetings, with that recognition that you're an expert, you're there to share information that they very likely don't have. And they are just people trying to do the best that they can, on a whole range of different issues that is, a ton of different topics. And so that can kind of help too, because it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but if you are able to go in confident, you're the expert, I think that can kind of help reduce some of those nerves. We always recommend folks bring leave behind resources, some sort of handouts, or at the very least contact information, but something, just because, as I said earlier, their time is limited. And so, whoever you're meeting with, especially if it's staff, they'll often be trying to take notes, so that they can then pass on those messages to the rest of their team and to the legislator themselves if you're not able to meet with them. But also, if you're only able to meet with them 5 to 10 minutes, it's hard to get into all the nitty-gritty of an issue. But if you're leaving behind resources that have more of that data and have more of that information, then they have that opportunity to dive deeper later, and can use those resources to inform a lot of other decisions that they make. So that's always really appreciated, so that they have something that then they can, put in a folder and share with their team later, or refer back to. But always contact information so that they can reach out. You can continue to kind of build that relationship. So that brings to the next step here, is that, it's really important that you approach these with the goal of building relationships. You might not always, feel like you've made an impact or really influenced anything the first time you've met with a legislator, but the more that you build that relationship with them or their staff, the more opportunities may arise. And, whatever you do, any sort of contact you make, see it as, somehow, some way to continue to build that. So you definitely want them to have your contact information so they can reach out, they know who you are, they can remember that conversation and come back to it later. I try to, in my work at VHA, approach all legislators as potential allies, try to keep open lines of communication, try to find opportunities for us to agree. If there's not a lot of things we do agree on, at least try to find something that they can say yes to. And then we can have, the bigger conversations about the things that I really disagree with. But that's really important. Kind of something to think about through this, just some good, easy kind of memory device here is the ABCDs. Make sure you're accurate, brief, just because there's often limitations, considerate, and trying to develop relationships. So you definitely want to be accurate because you want to be seen as an expert, as a reliable, dependable person that they can turn to for accurate information. So it's always better, if you don't know the answer, it's always better to say, I don't know, let me get back to you, than to try to guess at something and make a mistake. All right, I kind of already mentioned some of these things, but just some expectations just to keep in mind. I mentioned this a little bit, but you might not always meet with the legislator themselves, but you could meet with their staff. And that's still very important and very effective. That's not, that's not a bad thing. The vast majority of my meetings are with staff, but they still are very, very effective. Those staff are reporting that information to the legislator. And often the staff are the ones that are able to dive deeper into issues and actually kind of make decisions and make recommendations for the legislator. So being able to really get a staff person on your side, may be a lot easier than a legislator because they have a little bit, more time, but also if they're the ones that are kind of relied on as that issue topic expert, you've done your work there. You'll likely be communicating with their staff too to schedule that and to do any sort of follow-up or communications. It was hard to schedule these meetings. Sometimes they give you loose times to drop by. Sometimes there's last minute changes. So keep that in mind that it's not always something that's personal. I will say though, if you're trying to do get to know you meetings and really focus more on that relationship building, you do want to try to meet with the legislator themselves, not just their staff. So it's important to try to get both, but if you are just only able to get with staff, that's still really worth it. And then of course, because of all of this, do your best to be punctual, recognizing that it may be a big bag of like hurrying up and waiting. But whatever you can do to try to make it more likely that your schedules will align there and you'll be able to get some time, the better. Alrighty, well that is the end of my general overview. Really appreciate your attention and time. I know that I talked to you all a lot with a lot of different information. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Great, cool. Stop sharing my screen so that I can answer any sort of questions or any comments anyone has. Just a reminder again that you'll get the slides and the recording this week. So if there's a specific link or resource I mentioned that you want to be able to refer back to, you'll get access to that. But if anyone has any questions, you can put something in the chat. Oh, wait, I just accidentally raised my hand. I'll also put my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach out about anything else that I mentioned today. Oh, you're welcome, Sarah. Thank you. Appreciate you coming today. Anyone else? Any questions? I'll be on till 1 o'clock if anyone thinks of anything. If you have a question too about any specific, update right now, how this applies to something now, I'm going to try to briefly answer your question. Also encourage you to check out, the resources that I mentioned too that can go into more depth too. So just appreciate you guys attending and joining us to advocate. You're welcome, everyone. Thank you. Appreciate you. Okay, I see someone did post a question. So someone said, our legislators generally support issues in legislation we'd want them to without us asking and convincing them to. So how can we most effectively advocate with them? That's a great situation if that's how you're kind of feeling now. I think it's really important that we don't always necessarily assume that. And there's a lot that we can do to kind of work with these legislators as partners. You know, advocacy is not just trying to convince someone, to change from a no to a yes, but to help push someone to, prioritize a solution, to put more of their limited capacity to behind it, to brainstorm with them for creative solutions for how they can, work with you to, convince others in Congress, work with you know, their colleagues in Congress. There's also a lot that you can do to give them facts and stories that they can then use in those efforts when they're engaging with their colleagues and trying to build greater consensus around other things with folks who might not be agreeing with you. We see a lot of that work with the legislators who, are more likely to say agree with us on on certain things we see. It's really important that we're keeping them updated on changes, on how anything is impacting us on the ground, and giving them the tools that they need to then try to push other legislators to a yes instead of a no. But also often, I say a lot of my work is not necessarily people would agree, yeah, that's a good idea. But especially when it comes to funding, how can I get them to prioritize that and put more of the funding behind that, or agree that that they need to put more of their time behind something, and take a risk, a political risk, or do more than just say I agree with you. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it's really important to keep potential allies or partners like that well resourced, well educated, and continue to push them and help them do even more to prioritize some of those solutions. That was a great question. Appreciate you asking that. Does anyone else have any other questions? All right, well, there are very few of you left on here. Again, if you think of something later, don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me or email our general VHA email address, and we'll send these resources to you soon. Thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate it. Take care.